August 11th, 1919. Vienna, Austria. In a cramped apartment in the working-class district of Favoriten, a baby girl let out her first cry. No one looking at that tiny newborn could imagine that she would grow into one of the most sadistic women ever to walk the earth. Her name was Hermine Braunsteiner, and the world would come to know her by a far more chilling title, the Stomping Mare. But before she earned her nickname, before the screaming, the broken bones, the murdered children, the steel-toed boots smashing faces into mud, she was just another girl living in a fading empire's shadow. Poverty, hunger, political instability. These were the ingredients that formed her childhood. But they weren't what created the monster. That part came later. And when it came, the transformation was terrifying. Her father, Friedrich, was a streetcar conductor. A hard man with hard hands who believed discipline was more important than affection. Her mother, Maria, tried to keep the family together with scraps of warmth, but Vienna after World War I was a brutal place. Hermine grew up surrounded by resentment, by the bitterness of a defeated nation, by adults whispering about who was to blame for everything from starvation to humiliation. Children absorb these things like smoke, even if they don't understand them. Hermine was the youngest of 7. With so many mouths to feed, tenderness became a luxury. Survival meant obedience, it meant silence, and Hermine learned early that silence could protect her. But inside that silence, something dark was forming. Not pain, not kindness's absence, something else, something colder. As she grew older, she wanted more than anything to escape poverty. She dreamed of becoming a nurse, the uniforms, the authority, the certainty. But those dreams collapsed when she discovered she couldn't afford the training. She felt cheated, stripped of the life she thought she deserved. She wasn't going to be poor forever. She would find another way to climb. And in 1938, that other way arrived, marching beneath banners of red, white, and black. The Anschluss transformed Austria overnight. Nazi ideology washed through the streets of Vienna like a second religion. People who had lived their entire lives feeling powerless suddenly saw a new path to importance. And Hermine noticed something too. The Nazi Party loved women who followed orders, who enforced discipline, who could be ruthless without question. She saw opportunity. She applied to work as a housemaid for a wealthy Austrian family, but she wanted something more stable, something that offered authority. Then she heard about the SS Women's Auxiliaries, good pay, military status, a chance to leave behind her father's cramped apartment forever. In 1939, she applied to the Ravensbrook concentration camp as a female guard. And just like that, the door opened. When 20-year-old Hermine stepped into Ravensbrook for the first time, she saw a place unlike anything she had imagined. Barbed wire stretching endlessly. Watchtowers like skeletal fingers rising above fog. Thousands of women forced into hard labor, starved, beaten, crushed. She should have been horrified. Instead, she was fascinated. The power, the authority, the ability to command life and death with a gesture. It was intoxicating. She had grown up invisible, insignificant. Now prisoners looked at her with fear, and she loved it. Her supervisors noticed immediately. She didn't just follow orders, she enforced them with enthusiasm. While other guards hesitated to beat prisoners, Hermine did it without blinking. Soon she was promoted. More responsibility, more authority, more opportunities to unleash the cruelty she had kept locked inside for years. But Ravensbrook was only the beginning. In October 1942, she was transferred to a place even more terrifying. A place where mass murder wasn't occasional. It was industrial, Majdanek. Majdanek wasn't built for imprisonment, it was built for extermination. The moment Hermine arrived, she understood the rules. Prisoners weren't people. They were numbers, objects, disposable. And the guards weren't just expected to maintain discipline. They were expected to break spirits, crush hope, turn suffering into routine. And Hermine didn't just adapt, she flourished. Prisoners would later describe her boots before they described her face. Heavy, steel-capped, deadly. With those boots, she would kick women until their ribs snapped like dry twigs. She would stomp on their necks until they stopped moving. She would strike prisoners with a riding crop until their skin peeled. She would beat children for falling behind in work details. She became known for one particular act of cruelty, one that would earn her a name whispered in terror across the entire camp. The Stomping Mare. Survivors testified again and again. They saw her drag children by their hair, saw her choose which women would be loaded onto trucks headed for the gas chambers, saw her whip prisoners so violently that blood soaked into the dirt. But the most horrifying stories all had one detail in common: her boots. Hermine didn't just kick prisoners, she stomped them, again and again, with enough force to crush bone, enough force to kill. One mother said she watched in horror as Hermine grabbed her daughter, a girl no older than 8, and threw her onto a truck. The mother begged, screamed, fell to her knees. Hermine lifted her boot and kicked the woman in the throat so hard she collapsed, gasping on the ground. Hours later, the child was dead, and Hermine didn't lose a moment of sleep. Majdanek was a place of unending horror. Mass shootings, random beatings, thousands dying of starvation and disease. But even among the other guards, Hermine stood out. She didn't just follow brutality, she escalated it. But the worst was yet to come. In late 1943, Majdanek underwent one of the largest mass executions in the entire war, Operation Harvest Festival. 18,000 Jews shot in a single day. While SS men carried out the massacre, Hermine helped organize the prisoners, forcing them onto transport lines, striking them when they hesitated, beating them when they cried. Survivors said she moved through the chaos with a chilling calmness, like she was directing foot traffic, not mass murder. After the operation, Hermine was awarded the War Merit Cross, second class, a medal for loyalty and exceptional service. She had helped destroy thousands of lives, and the Nazi regime rewarded her for it. By early 1944, she was known across Majdanek for her ruthlessness. The slightest mistake brought her wrath. A dropped tool, a stumble during roll call, a whispered conversation. All worthy of beatings that left prisoners unable to stand. She became so feared that prisoners would freeze whenever they heard her voice. Even SS officers admitted that she seemed to enjoy cruelty more than most. But her reign at Majdanek was approaching its end. As the Soviet Red Army advanced toward Poland, the SS began evacuating camps. Evidence needed to be destroyed. Prisoners needed to be marched west. And Hermine needed to escape before the world learned exactly what she had done. In April 1944, she was transferred to Krakow, then to Ravensbrook again, this time as a more experienced, more brutal guard. But nothing compared to the horror she had unleashed at Majdanek. The camp consumed her. It shaped her. It revealed the worst parts of her. And even though she left Majdanek physically, she carried the darkness with her. When the war finally ended in 1945, Hermine Braunsteiner didn't surrender. She didn't confess. She didn't even hesitate. She shaved the SS runes off her boots, hid her past, and slipped into the rubble of post-war Europe like a ghost. What she didn't expect was that her crimes would follow her, because the world wasn't done with the Stomping Mare, and her reckoning was only beginning. For a moment, it looked like she had escaped justice entirely. Vienna was in ruins. Austria was broken, hungry, chaotic. Millions were on the move. Records were lost, identities blurred. And Hermine slipped into the confusion like she had been preparing for it her entire life. No boots, no uniform, no rank. Just another displaced woman claiming she had been a factory worker during the war. The terrifying thing is, it worked. For a while. She took domestic jobs, cleaned houses, cooked meals, and blended into normal society with the same cold efficiency she once used to blend into the SS. No one suspected her. No one looked at her and saw the Stomping Mare. They saw a quiet, polite Austrian woman trying to survive. Then, unbelievably, in 1959, she met an American tourist named Russell Ryan, a soft-spoken merchant seaman from New York. They fell in love. They married, and in 1964 she immigrated to the United States. The woman who once stomped prisoners to death walked into America legally, with a visa, a new last name, and a smile for the immigration officers. Eli, imagine that. A woman who sent countless children to gas chambers was now living in Queens, New York, shopping for groceries, chatting with neighbors, feeding cats, going to church on Sundays. If that doesn't chill your soul, nothing will. The neighbors adored her, called her friendly, sweet, helpful. They had no idea she once kicked a woman so violently that her intestines ruptured. They had no idea about the children she threw onto trucks headed to the gas chambers. They had no idea their neighbor had a nickname whispered by survivors with trembling lips. But meanwhile, far across the ocean, survivors of Majdanek had not forgotten her. They were scattered across countries, living rebuilt lives, trying to outrun memories that never faded. And every now and then, someone would ask the same haunting question. What happened to the Stomping mare? In 1968, the answer finally surfaced. A German journalist named Eleanor Wehr, investigating Nazi war criminals living abroad, noticed something strange. A woman named Hermine Ryan, formerly Braunsteiner, living comfortably in Queens. Wehr dug deeper, cross-referenced testimonies, compared photos. And the truth hit her like a punch to the chest. The Stomping mare was living a quiet life in New York City. Wehr contacted American authorities, and what followed was one of the most dramatic unmaskings of a Nazi war criminal in U.S. history. Journalists surrounded Hermine's home, demanding answers. Neighbors watched in disbelief as police escorted her out for questioning. The mask cracked. The calm, gentle demeanor fell apart. But Hermine did what she always did when cornered. She lied. She denied beating prisoners. She denied stomping women to death. She denied choosing children for gas chambers. She denied everything, insisting she was a simple camp secretary who only guarded gates and did clerical work. She said witnesses had mistaken her for someone else, but her lies were no match for the testimonies of the people she brutalized. One survivor after another came forward. They remembered her boots. They remembered the way she smiled when she kicked women across the yard. They remembered her voice. They remembered the children. They remembered everything. The U.S. government began proceedings to revoke her citizenship. During the hearings, one survivor stood up and pointed directly at her. "That is the woman who kicked my mother until she died." Hermine's expression didn't change. She just sat there, motionless, as if the testimonies were inconveniences, not nightmares she had created. In 1971, the U.S. officially stripped her of citizenship for lying on her immigration forms. She was arrested, placed in handcuffs, and marched out of her home in Queens. For the first time since 1945, the Stomping mare was no longer free. But justice still required one more step. Extradition. Germany wanted her returned to face charges for the crimes she committed at Majdanek, and after multiple appeals and legal battles, Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan was finally extradited in 1973. The journey she thought she had escaped was dragging her back, step by step, toward the horrors she left behind. In Germany, the trial became known as the Majdanek trial, one of the largest war crimes trials in post-war history. Survivors traveled from across the world to testify. Many had carried their trauma for 30 years. Many had nightmares every night. Many had vowed never to speak of Majdanek again. But they came. They came because they remembered her boots. Witness after witness described her cruelty, her violence, her sadism. A woman recalled watching Hermine throw starving children onto trucks headed for the gas chambers. Another recounted how Hermine selected hundreds of women for death purely because she disliked them. Many told the court she stomped prisoners so violently their faces became unrecognizable. Some testimonies were so horrifying that judges paused the trial to let survivors recover. The courtroom air grew thick with emotion. Even hardened prosecutors felt sick. But Hermine sat there stone-faced. No tears, no remorse, no apology. She said only one thing: "I never killed anyone." It was the same line Irma Grisi used before her execution. Same cold denial, same lack of conscience, same monstrous disconnect from reality. But the evidence crushed her. Witnesses were consistent, records matched. Her SS promotions aligned with the timeline of atrocities. The court had everything it needed. In 1981, after a staggering 7-year trial, the verdict came. Guilty. The judge sentenced her to life imprisonment for her role in the murder of at least 80 people and the brutal abuse of hundreds more. It should have been thousands, but not every crime had a surviving witness, and the court could only convict on proven cases. Hermine collapsed when the sentence was read. The cold mask cracked. For the first time in her life, she realized she couldn't escape. The stomping mare was finally caged. In prison, she wasn't feared. She wasn't respected. She wasn't important. She was just another aging inmate with a past she could no longer hide. The woman who once kicked prisoners to death now limped from arthritis. The woman who once commanded terror now shuffled through prison corridors alone. She grew ill over the years, diabetes eating away at her strength. In 1996, after serving 15 years, she was released early due to her failing health. The world had moved on. Her crimes hadn't. She spent her final years in a small home for the elderly in Bochum, Germany. No visitors, no friends, no neighbors calling her sweet or kind. Just silence. The same silence she grew up with. The same silence she tried to fill with cruelty. The same silence she once forced onto thousands of victims. On April 19, 1999, she died of complications from diabetes. No one mourned her, no memorials, no tributes. Just a death certificate and a burial that drew no crowd. And that was the end of Hermine Braunsteiner, the stomping mare. But her story didn't end there, because the question still burns like a wound that won't heal. How does an ordinary girl from a working-class family turn into a monster who kills children with her boots? How many others walked the same path? How many hid behind new names, new lives, new lies? They offered her every chance to explain herself. But the words never came. She wasn't speechless. She wasn't confused. She simply refused to acknowledge a world that wasn't built around cruelty and domination. For years, she had lived inside a system that rewarded brutality, and now she was expected to play by human rules again. She couldn't. She wouldn't. Her silence wasn't fear. It was contempt, a final flash of the arrogance that had once made prisoners tremble before her boots. The longer the investigators watched her, the clearer it became. The woman sitting across from them still believed she had done nothing wrong. That was the most chilling part. Evil is terrifying in action, but it's even more terrifying when it doesn't recognize itself as evil. Braunsteiner wasn't ashamed. She wasn't broken. She wasn't apologetic. Her past lived inside her like a stone that could never be cracked open. Her trial was one of those moments where history stops pretending to be distant. The courtroom doors opened, and witnesses shuffled in, one by one, carrying memories they never wanted but could never shake loose. They looked at her with a mixture of hatred, sorrow, and something deeper, something close to betrayal. Many had once been girls in the camp, teenagers who had learned the brutality of adulthood far too early. Now they were older, quieter, hardened by time. And there she sat, the woman they remembered, only older, heavier, but unmistakably the same. When the first witness spoke, the atmosphere changed. Her voice was thin, barely louder than a whisper, but in that room it hit like thunder. She described the boots first, because everyone always described the boots. The way they sounded on the dirt, the way they landed on human bodies, the way Braunsteiner used them not as shoes, but as weapons. The witness didn't cry. She didn't tremble. Her body had learned long ago how to bury fear, but the memory of the woman on trial was so sharp it felt like she was reliving the scene again. Another witness followed, then another. Each story built on the last until the courtroom wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was Majdanek reconstructed through testimony, a place where hope had been unsafe and life had been cheap. The judges felt it, the journalists felt it, even the guards standing along the wall felt it. Braunsteiner didn't. Her face rarely moved. She sat motionless, eyes dull, hands resting on the table like she was waiting for a bus. Her lack of reaction almost became a reaction itself. People expected tears, or disgust, or denial, or at the very least the faint tremor of recognition. They got nothing. She was a void. And inside that void, the truth echoed louder than any confession. She had never seen her victims as people. There is something monstrous in that kind of emptiness. Every so often she shifted her posture, adjusting her weight as if inconvenienced by the length of the trial. When the stories grew particularly horrific, she sometimes looked irritated, like someone forced to listen to a conversation they weren't interested in. She didn't look at the witnesses. She didn't acknowledge their pain. Her eyes wandered past them, focusing on a spot neither near nor far, somewhere between denial and disdain. One day, during a particularly harrowing testimony, one of the witnesses finally snapped. She stood from the stand, tears streaking down her cheeks, and pointed directly at Braunsteiner. Her voice cracked into a scream as she shouted the words that had lived inside her for decades, that the woman in front of her had murdered without hesitation, had enjoyed the power, had destroyed futures without a single second thought. The courtroom froze. Security moved. Judges shouted for order. But the witness didn't stop pointing until her strength gave out, and she collapsed back into her seat. Everyone turned to see how Braunsteiner would react. She blinked once, twice, then looked away. That moment defined her trial more than any legal argument ever could. For months, the testimonies piled up. Survivors from different countries, different bunkhouses, different experiences, but always circling back to the same name, the same presence, the same figure who moved through the camp like a storm without mercy. Her cruelty wasn't occasional. It was habitual. It wasn't emotional. It was procedural. She didn't kill in moments of anger or panic. She killed because it was routine, and routine is always more terrifying than rage. Her defense team tried angles that evaporated the instant they touched reality. They claimed mistaken identity, but the witnesses never faltered. They claimed exaggeration, but the patterns matched too perfectly. They claimed she was following orders, yet every survivor insisted her violence wasn't obedience. It was initiative. She didn't wait for instructions. She created her own. At one point, her lawyers tried to paint her as a product of her time, a woman swept into a deadly machine she couldn't escape. But the prosecutors countered with documents showing her promotions, her commendations, her rewards for brutality. She had not been trapped. She had thrived. As the trial continued, journalists coined a phrase for her, the face of unrepentant cruelty. They didn't mean her expression was frightening. They meant her lack of one was. The evidence was overwhelming. Archival records, Nazi paperwork, survivor identifications, physical descriptions that aligned perfectly, and most condemning of all, the sheer consistency across hundreds of stories. Different languages, different continents, same woman. The court could ignore many things, but not that. What broke the last piece of Braunsteiner's facade wasn't testimony. It wasn't evidence. It was the moment the prosecution described in detail how she had carried out selections, how she had chosen who would live another day and who would walk to their death. They explained how she wielded life and death not with sorrow or hesitation, but with chilling efficiency. The judges leaned forward. The public leaned forward. Even the guards leaned forward. For the first time, Braunsteiner's face tightened, not in remorse, not in fear, but in frustration, like someone annoyed that their past was being mischaracterized. She shook her head slightly, whispered to her attorney, glanced at the judges with a cold, controlled defiance. It was the only time she showed emotion, and it was the wrong one. Eventually, after months of testimony and analysis, the final day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was silent. Judges in their robes walked in with expressions carved from stone. Survivors who had waited decades for this moment filled the seats. The reporters held their breath, and Braunsteiner, as always, sat with her chin slightly raised, a woman who had learned long ago how to stare down consequences. The verdict echoed like a hammer inside that chamber. Guilty. Multiple counts. Crimes against humanity. The weight of those words should have crushed her. But she didn't flinch. In fact, for a moment, she looked relieved. Not because she accepted justice, but because the trial was over. Because she no longer had to hear the voices of those she once controlled. Because she no longer needed to confront the world that still remembered what she wanted to forget. But there was something else, a shift in the air, a tightening in the room. A sense that, despite her numbness, the past had finally caught her. She was sentenced. Guards approached. She stood, and for the first time in decades the survivors saw her not as the towering figure of Majdanek, not as the brutal woman whose boots haunted their memories, but as an aging criminal led away in chains. Justice doesn't erase pain. It doesn't resurrect the dead. It doesn't undo the nightmares, but it does something quieter, something heavier. It closes the door that once stood wide open. For Braunsteiner, that door slammed shut. She disappeared behind it, and the world exhaled. Prison didn't change her. People hoped it would. They imagined that isolation, age, and years of reflection might chip away at the stone inside her, that maybe time could force humility where morality never existed. But Hermine Braunsteiner lived her final years the same way she lived her youth, without remorse, without introspection, without the faintest tremor of guilt. She adapted quickly to the routine. Woke up, ate, slept, existed. The guards said she rarely spoke unless she had to, and when she did, her tone carried that same cold detachment she'd worn her entire life. Some prisoners break under the weight of their pasts, some crumble quietly. Others unravel loudly. Braunsteiner did neither. She simply endured, as if punishment was just another environment she had been assigned to, another system to operate inside. Every now and then, a reporter would attempt to request an interview, hoping for some fragment of regret or some confession to close the chapter more neatly. She refused all of them. She didn't want to explain herself. She didn't want to reflect. She didn't want history's questions pressed against her skin. In her silence there was no mystery, just emptiness. She grew older, frailer, slower. The sharpness of her posture softened, but it didn't warm her. Even as her body weakened, her eyes stayed cold. Nurses who tended to her in her last years described her as distant, observing everything, connecting to nothing. If they didn't know her past, they said, they would have just assumed she was an unfriendly old woman. But once you knew who she was, that distance felt darker, heavier, almost haunting. Outside the prison walls, the world kept changing. New wars, new headlines, new horrors, new debates. But threads of the past never disappeared. Survivors aged, some passed away, others lived long enough to know that she had been found, tried, and punished. For many that was enough. Not closure, not healing, but acknowledgement. The world had looked their suffering in the face and said, "We believe you." That alone made the years of pursuit worth it. As her health declined, doctors recommended she be transferred to a facility more equipped to handle her medical issues. Eventually, she left the prison, not as a free woman, but as a patient in a controlled environment. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who once decided who lived and who died now had her own life measured by charts and vital signs and supervised care. There was a moment in those years, small and almost inconsequential, but it stuck with the people who witnessed it. A nurse helped her sit up one morning, adjusting her pillow, making sure she was comfortable. As she worked, a documentary about the Holocaust played faintly on a television in the background. The scenes were muted, but recognizable. Footage of camps, survivors giving testimonies, photographs of the dead. The nurse glanced at Braunsteiner. She wasn't watching. She wasn't listening. She stared blankly ahead, eyes fixed on a blank part of the wall, refusing to engage with even the smallest mirror of the world she helped build. The past reached for her. She refused to turn her head. No regrets, not even at the end. Her final days were quiet. No family rushing to her bedside. No friends from her old life. No supporters. No one waiting for her last breath. When it came, it passed the same way she had gone through every confrontation with her past, without acknowledgement, without apology, without a single spoken word about the thousands of lives she shattered. Death didn't redeem her. Death didn't punish her. It merely closed the book that history would write for her anyway. News of her passing spread quickly. For some survivors, it brought a strange sense of release. Not joy, not satisfaction, just a loosening of the tension that had lived inside them for decades. The ghost of her presence, that lingering shadow from Majdanek, finally dissolved. Historians wrote their final assessments. Journalists summarized her crimes. People who had never heard her name learned it for the first time and recoiled. But the ones who lived under her authority during those years didn't need recaps. They had carried the memories since childhood. They knew the truth long before the world did. Her legacy was carved by the people she tried to erase. And in that, there's a quiet victory. The painful execution of Hermine Braunsteiner wasn't a swift drop at the gallows, or a firing squad's bullet, or a dramatic final moment broadcast to the world. Her execution was slower, stretched across decades. It was the legal pursuit that dragged her out of her new life. The testimonies that exposed her indifference. The conviction that stripped away her anonymity. The years spent behind bars. The silence that consumed her last breath. Her execution was justice delivered not in a single act, but in a long, steady dismantling of the life she tried to build after the ashes settled. She wanted to be forgotten. The world did not grant her that mercy. She wanted her victims to disappear. They became the voices that defined her. And in the end, the woman who once controlled the fate of thousands died powerless, nameless, and judged by history in the only way she deserved.